It took no, don't say that. But mostly this explores mental Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance, and I hope you are too. I know it's been a long time since I've actually recorded a video talking about the books I've read. At least it's been a long time since I've talked about books in an upbeat, positive way. The last video I published was my reviews of the Booktube prize books, and if you watched that video, you know it was quite spicy, quite saucy. I had some choice words to say about the books that I was assigned to read. I was angry. I was an angry woman after reading those books, but I'm over that. I'm over the trauma of those books, and I'm here to start anew. And as I was preparing for this video, or as I was preparing to record again, I was trying to think of what am I going to record first, because I've read quite a few books outside of the Booktube prize books since I recorded last. I think my last wrap-up was for February, so I haven't talked about really any other book that I've read in March, or April for that matter, other than the Booktube prize books. So I was trying to decide, well, should I do a wrap-up video first, which would include, I realized, a lot of the books that I have read from the Women's Prize for Fiction. Then I thought, I better talk about the Women's Prize for Fiction books, because I want to talk about the ones I've read so far before the shortlist comes out, which is this coming Wednesday. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about. And oh boy, what a time I've been having with the Women's Prize for Fiction. This could very easily turn into another spicy video, come to think of it, because as good of a time as I had last year, and as much as I loved so many of the books from the long list last year, this has been a very different experience for me. I haven't watched a whole lot of other Booktube videos regarding the books on the long list, so I'm really not even sure what other people's experiences have been, with the exception of one of the books that a lot of people are loving, that I DNF'd. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Let's just get into it. I'm here to talk to you about the books I've read so far on the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. I'm going to talk to you about them in the order that I have read them or have attempted to read them. So let's start with the first one. The first one that I picked up from the long list is Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. I remember last spring when this book came out, and when I read about it, I was excited about it. It sounded interesting. This follows an American-Palestinian woman, I think Sophia is her name, and she's kind of having an existential crisis. She is an actress. Her career is failing. She has just broken up with a director that she had this romance with. So she decides to go home to visit her family and just kind of regroup. And she ends up joining a theater group there and is cast in a Shakespeare play that they're putting on. And I think just the point of the book is about how being disconnected from your people, your family, can really affect your life, and having a shared bond with people over a mutual resistance. And I think it's also meant to demonstrate a rendering of present day Palestine. I probably read close to 100 pages on this one. I gave it a solid attempt, and I, to put it quite simply, was bored. I just didn't care. I really wanted to learn kind of the history of Palestine and its conflicts and what's going on, kind of through the eyes of really the author, but through fictional characters, the way I learn about a lot of history, which I enjoy very much. And I just wasn't getting it. I feel like the people who are getting that information from this story already have kind of a working knowledge of the history and the conflict. So it might have just been over my head. But as far as the story is concerned and how that history was told, it just wasn't working for me. So I DNF'd my very first book. I feel like this happened last year. I can't remember which book I picked up first from the long list last year. There's a good way to find out. Actually, the first two books that I read from the long list last year, I didn't know they were from the long list yet because I was reading them for the Booktube prize, and that was Memphis and Demon Copperhead, which of course both I loved very much. I then read Pod and then The Bandit Queens, both of which I also loved. And then the first one that I didn't really care for was The Dog of the North. Glory was the first DNF from last year's long list, and Cursed Bread was the other DNF from last year's long list. So anyways, I digress. First book I picked up from the 2024 long list was a DNF. Total bummer. The next book that I attempted and finished was And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This is a debut novel. I listened to this book, which didn't help it for me. I didn't hate it, but it wasn't super compelling for me. This follows an Indigenous woman who is living with her husband in a white Toronto neighborhood, and she is dealing with postpartum psychosis. This is marketed as a horror, which really excited me for this book, and I was completely disappointed in that aspect. There is not a horror in any way, shape, or form. There's a somewhat paranormal aspect to it, but mostly the story deals with mental illness, trauma, racism, oppression, postpartum depression. I think what was hard for me to connect with the character was listening to it. The narrator made her sound like a teenager. And this is not to say that teenagers don't deal with serious problems, but the problems that this particular main character had wouldn't be experienced the same way by a teenager. And so I felt there was a disconnect there. And it was just hard for me to take her issues seriously when she's talking like, oh my God, I can't stand the position I'm in. That might be a slight exaggeration, but she had the inflection and the vernacular of a teenager, and I just couldn't follow. One of the criteria for being nominated for the Women's Prize is originality, and I think where this was going as far as originality, because certainly talking about trauma and mental illness and oppression is not an original topic these days. But I think what the author was trying to do was use the paranormal aspect of it to help the main character cope with the things that she was coping with. So, that's the only thing I can think of, because nothing else I think about this story was earth-shattering in originality. So I was a little bit disappointed. I didn't hate it, but it was a disappointment. And then following a DNF, I was like, okay, what's happening here? Let's get to the books that I'm going to love. And my prayers were answered by the next book that I read, and that is In Defense of the Act by Effie Black. This one really took me by surprise. I liked this one way more than I expected to like it. And this one deals with a very dark topic. The act that is referred to in the title is suicide. This follows Jessica, who is a young scientist whose topic of research is why people end their lives. The structure of the book is almost like her talking directly to you, or she's writing in some kind of journal. So you're inside Jessica's head, and in her mind, there's more positive outcomes to somebody successfully committing suicide than not. And she gives examples of them. And the examples that she gives are quite compelling. And you find yourself as a reader saying, you might be onto something. It's just very interesting how it makes you think about things. You really get to know Jessica. I connected with her. I found her interesting. I found her smart. I found her life and experiences relatable. I highly recommend this book. At first, when I picked it up and saw that it was less than 200 pages, I thought, isn't this too short for the Women's Prize as far as the criteria? But then I, of course, did some Googling on what is considered a full-length novel, and this meets that requirement. But if you're a little bit reluctant to pick up this book because of the darkness of the subject matter, also know that this is also about how we are as individuals more than the sum of our parts. We're more than the experiences that we've had. We're more than the acts that we have done, things to other people, things in our lives for ourselves. And I really like how she approached that. This book didn't just meet the criteria for the Women's Prize, and the criteria I'm talking about is originality, accessibility, and excellence. And this book has all of those in spades. Definitely read this one. The next book I read was Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshananthan. This is one that I was really excited about. It seemed right up my alley as far as it being historical fiction. It covered an event that I had absolutely no knowledge about, and I was very interested in learning about. This book is set in the 80s during the civil war in Sri Lanka. And you're following Sashi, who is a 16-year-old girl living in Sri Lanka, and she has big dreams of becoming a doctor. She has 4 brothers. As the story unfolds, you are watching kind of her dreams and her outlook for the future shift as this war escalates. And you're also following how the war affects each of her brothers differently, and what happens to them and what happens to her family as a result of this war. And this book had so much potential to really rip my heart out in a good way, but I felt like it read like a history book. I learned a lot. It's like this did the absolute other polar opposite of Enter Ghost. I learned way more than I expected to learn, but I didn't really get anything from the story. I did not connect with Sashi at all. I didn't connect with her brothers. I didn't empathize with Sashi's struggles or anybody's struggles more than I would empathize with any stranger. I mean, I understand this really happened and a lot of people suffered. I have that kind of remote empathy that you have when you're following stories like that, but I wanted to connect on a deeper level with the characters in a way that I thought I would when I read the synopsis for this book. But it just read like a history book. And if you want to know about the Civil War in Sri Lanka, I definitely recommend this book. And maybe you'll connect with the characters a little bit better than I did. But if that's not something that is super important to you, then yes, I would recommend Brotherless Night. As far as it's meeting the criteria for the long list, I mean, again, I think with originality, it's a little bit lacking. It was easy to read. I think it was well written. So I would think it even meets the excellence criteria. But with this book and several of the books on the list that I've read, originality has been somewhat lacking. So unfortunately, another disappointment for me. This next book I'm going to talk to you about, I have a very unpopular opinion about this one, and the book I'm talking about is Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. I DNF this one. There's so many people out there that I've heard absolutely love this book. From what I understand, this follows a woman's connection. I think it's like a monologue from a woman to her infant son. It talks about connection between mother and child and her experiences. And if you've watched my channel for a while, you know that not only do I not have human children, I have never had the desire for human children. I don't feel like my life is missing anything because I didn't have children. I could go on this huge long rant, but this is neither the time or the place. I just didn't connect, and it was immediate. I probably read 6 pages. I just knew it wasn't going to be a book for me. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be able to talk about whether this book succeeded in meeting the excellence criteria, but I feel like a woman talking to her child about how hard it was to have the child and to be a mother, explaining to the child how life was so different before the child came along. I don't think that's original. And also a book written by a mother about a mother and is for, I think, other mothers. I don't think it meets the accessibility criteria. Come at me if you will. I mean no disrespect to any mothers out there, but there is a huge population of people out there male and female, who have never been mothers, have never wanted to be mothers, will never be mothers, who don't care about that experience. I said what I said. Moving on. The next book I read, I ended up absolutely loving. And the one I'm talking about is Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. This is Irish literature. It's marketed as somewhat of a procedural crime thriller. I wouldn't call it a crime thriller, but I feel like it was a very interesting plot device to talk about familial and intergenerational despair, at the same time exploring poverty and classism. This was brilliantly written, and I was intrigued every single minute. I listened to it, which was fantastic. This follows an Irish family who has relocated to London. A child has died, and the primary suspect is another child. This explores how just being reclusive can make you seem suspect when something bad happens. This explores how the media can be absolute vultures in every sense of the word. This also explores addiction. There's lots and lots of really dark stuff in this story, but the title is so perfect because while this family is dealing with so much, I mean, you think there's just too much bad stuff that's happening to this family. It's not anything that so many regular people haven't had to deal with. But it's not all doom and gloom. I'm not saying this had a happy ending, but I felt very satisfied with how this book ended. It's a great story. It's compelling. It's everything that any book on the Women's Prize for Fiction Longlist should be. If this and In the Defense of the Act are not on the short list, I'm going to boycott. Probably not, but I really hope to see this one on the short list, and I highly recommend you read it. It's outstanding. Next, I read River East, River West by Aubrey Lescure. This one also had a lot of potential, being historical fiction, has two timelines, two perspectives, and I was engaged. I didn't dislike this book. I just didn't love it. So this is part coming of age and part social and family drama. You're following Alva, who is 14 years old. She's a Chinese American living in Shanghai. It's 2007. And she's never known her Chinese father, and she's being raised by her single white American mother. And then you're also following Lu Fang, who is a young Chinese man back in 1985. He's a young married man, and he meets a young white American woman, and things happen there. And it's really a story about how these two main characters are finding their place in the world. And it's kind of the opposite of the typical East to West immigration story, because you're dealing with two generations of Chinese folks in a rapidly developing China, each of them searching in their own way for a sense of belonging and opportunity. And I found it was an interesting story. I was definitely engaged in Alva's story and Lu Fang's story, and I found it interesting how their stories interconnected. I think what ended up disappointing me the most about this story was I expected there to be more of a connection between those two characters by the end of the book. I just didn't find that that was the case. So while I appreciated Alva's story and her kind of finding her way as a teenager, I found that relatable. I thought it was very well written. I like a good coming of age story. I like a good historical fiction. This was just okay for me. Next book I read was Nightbloom by Peace Medi Adzo. This one I remember putting on one of my videos, books that I'm excited to be released, and it's been on my TBR ever since. I was excited to see this one on the long list. I listened to this one. This one follows two Ghanaian women who were, as children, the very best of friends. They are technically family, they're cousins, but they are super close as children, and you're following them as certain events take place and their relationship starts to divide and they're not as close anymore. they don't talk anymore, and then decades go by, and as older women, they are brought back together again, and they are confronted with what divided them to begin with. The structure of this book is, I think, was the biggest problem for me. I can't remember their names, but you have each of the women's perspective. But instead of going back and forth in a linear fashion, you follow one woman's story in its entirety, and then you go back and follow the other woman's story in its entirety, and you start from the beginning again. No, I did not like that at all. I felt like these were two entirely different stories. And one of the things that could have made it better was if you read the first person story and you found out certain events and you got an idea of, oh, this is what happened in the relationship and why they stopped being as close as they were. And then you read the other person's and you read the same event and you see how things could have been misunderstood or misconstrued. But instead, they seemed like completely separate events. So you can't really empathize with either one of them because it was like they were having completely understandable experiences with separate events, if that makes sense. You're supposedly reading about one singular event experienced by two characters, but that's not how it reads at all. So how do you empathize with the misunderstanding that happened between these two women? The answer is you don't. At least I didn't. So I felt like this was just two separate stories about two separate women who happen to know each other. So while I found each woman's life story interesting and I didn't have a hard time picking up the book, and I liked each of those stories separately, I didn't feel like it was a cohesive story between the two women that could have been so much better if it was. It was well written in the sense that I enjoyed reading it. I did find it accessible. I didn't find the story very original. So yeah, it was a decent book, and that's about it. And finally, the last book that I have read from the long list is Restless Dolly Maunder by Kate Grenville. This one, I will say, I liked more than I expected. As I was reading it, I found it somewhat slow, but the main character, Dolly Maunder, was so engaging and compelling that I kept reading. The story itself, there's really, not much of one until you get to the end and you realized what it's about. I know you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that doesn't sound very compelling at all. Well, I don't want to give anything away, but Dolly Maunder is a fascinating woman. She is a woman you will root for one page and then want to slap the crap out of the next page. She is completely relatable, good, bad, or indifferent. She is a woman that you will appreciate as a woman. It just basically follows this Australian woman at the beginning of the 20th century and how she wants to be an independent woman. She wants to work as a teacher. She wants so much, but she's born in the wrong time period, and there's no way any man is going to let her get the things that she wants. But she endures and she perseveres and she breaks all the rules. And that's all I'm going to say about this. As I was reading the book, I was enjoying her character more than any plot that was going on. But when I finished the last page and realized truly what this book is about, I really, really appreciated it. Now, before I read this book, I had heard that it's based on the author's own grandmother. And I was a little annoyed by that because that smacked of familiarity of the experience I had last year with one of the books that I felt was a memoir that was shifted a little bit and turned into a fiction book and had no place on the Women's Prize for Fiction. But that's a whole nother story. But I thought perhaps that was going on with this book, but it's not. It's based on the author's idea that she had about how her grandmother grew up to be the woman that she was, because the author's grandmother died when the author was very, very young. So it's not biographical in any way. It's just based on the idea the author had in her head about what her grandmother's life would be like as she was a young girl and growing up during the early 20th century. So that I have no problem with. So yes, I enjoyed this one. Did I love it? I loved the idea of it, but as I was reading it, I wasn't loving it. I loved her. I thought she was great, and I thought she was very fleshed out as far as the type of human she was, flawed in a number of ways, but I found her likable anyways. I won't be mad if this one makes the short list. So that's it. Those are the books that I have read from the long list. Now, I usually have the goal of reading every book, or at least attempting to read every book on the long list. But by the time I got 9 books in, and I had 2 DNFs, so many of them being meh, I have decided that I am not going to read any more from the long list, and the only other books that I am going to read from the Women's Prize this year are ones that are on the short list that I haven't read yet. So hopefully I only have 3 more to read, but I'm not going to attempt to read them before the short list comes out on Wednesday. I just am not having as good of a time with this list, and I'm also not going to try to predict what is on the short list. I hope to see In Defense of the Act. I hope to see Ordinary Human Failings. Those are my biggest hopes for the short list. Would I have made plans to actually go to the Women's Prize live show coming in June had I waited until now? I don't know, but I am going. It will be fun. It'll be interesting. I'll be going with my mom. I'm super excited about the trip, but it'll be a different experience this year. So I don't know. How are you guys doing with reading these books? I would love to hear your thoughts. What are your favorites? What are the ones that you hope to see on the short list? I would love to know that. Or you could just say hi down in the doodly-doo. Thank you all so much for your ongoing support. I really appreciate you watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.